everyone. Welcome to the first edition of our interview today with Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who needs no introduction. As part of the inauguration of Polonica TV, we will be featuring interviews with heavy hitters from across the pond, so to say, in the United States, and not only to discuss geopolitical matters that aren't discussed, unfortunately, in the Polish mainstream media, but that's where we come in. We want to fill the void and talk about everything that is politically incorrect from a realist, patriotic, Western perspective, bring you perspectives that you are not used to and ones that hopefully will broaden your view of the situation in Poland and around the world. Colonel Macgregor, how are you today?
Very good there, Dr. Krupa.
Colonel, that a lot of people value the input in your book. We actually begin the book with our lengthy interview and the insight that you give. And it turns out that a lot of what you said about the Ukrainian war, about the correlation of forces, about what happened that led to this war, the sequence of events has come true. And recently, I've come across words that were spoken by none other than Antony Blinken. It was a speech that he gave in 2015, actually, where he talked about, and this was just after the Maidan revolution, where he talked about, he made a very surprising statement from today's perspective, because he basically said, if we fall into the mirage of feeding Ukraine with weapons and money, it'll only embolden the Russians, and the Russians obviously have escalatory dominance in their neighborhood. So it generally doesn't make sense that we push this escalation, which seemed very sound at the time. However, just a few years on, they're doing the exact opposite. So from your perspective, Colonel Macgregor, from the American perspective, as a former insider, a person who has much to say on this issue, why the change in the rhetoric of such people as Antony Blinken?
Well, two things. Blinken is what you would call a loyal soldier. This is not someone who has ever held a very prominent position, at least not until he became Secretary of State. He was always a staff officer or staff member. And that was the case during the Obama administration. And what he expressed was the policy position at the time, which was very reasonable. And it took note of the reality that you mentioned. Why would you start a war on Russia's doorstep? You have no chance whatsoever of winning. But remember that you had a number of things that developed in the years afterwards, which is a stronger influence exerted by the so-called globalist neocon class in Washington, D.C., growing hostility towards Russia, which was fed inside the administration at the time by many, many forces that saw an opportunity as well as value in conflict with Russia and thought that they could utilize Ukraine as a sort of battering ram. But I think that Blinken is just a go along, get along man on the left. He's a stalwart that can always be relied upon to step out and say whatever he's told to say is the position, which is one of the reasons that we've got the problem we do in Washington. We have too many people that fall into that category.
It's interesting because his boss, President Obama, right about the same time, I think it was an interview with The Atlantic, he also stated that if we give weapons to the Ukrainians, we'll give them a false sense of security that they can prevail over the Russians. So it's kind of surprising because, as you and I are very critical of the Obama administration, and rightly so, but even at that time, the wisdom still seemed to prevail despite all the wrong turns that the United States took, starting in, let's say, about November 2013, when the Maidan began in earnest. Then obviously we had the Trump administration, for which you served briefly, where the weapons actually did start flowing into Ukraine. Then we had that escalatory spiral of which Blinken spoke of. So we are where we are today. And I would just like you to give our listeners and viewers a broad overview of where we are today and what predictions you could give us for the next, 2-3 weeks, maybe max a month, of what's going to happen on the battlefront, because that's where your expertise lie. We know that the Russians have begun advancing towards Kharkiv. There are movements on Chasiv Yar, which is a strategic point on the battlefield map. Where do you think the progression of events will move on the battlefield, Colonel Macgregor?
Well, right now, we have a great deal of evidence to suggest that the Russians have concentrated in the neighborhood of 100,000 troops in the northern portion of the area they occupy, with the goal ultimately of taking Kharkov. And as we've discussed on many, many occasions, this was an inevitable objective. 2+ years ago, Vladimir Putin, once he recognized that he had to commit to a full-fledged war, which admittedly took him at least 5-6 months to come around to understanding that. When he did, he made it very clear that Kharkov and Odessa, both historically Russian cities and Russian-speaking cities, would once again be Russian. So no one should be surprised by it. What's interesting is that even now, the Russian advance is very deliberate. It's very slow by our standards. We normally think in lightning terms. We're still enamored in the West of World War II and these German advances over vast stretches of territory. We fail to take into account that if we stop and consider the Maginot Line, it was never penetrated. The Maginot Line fell once the German army was behind it, but it didn't fall prior to that. If the Maginot Line had been completed, you would have seen something very similar to what you saw with the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians hurling themselves against impregnable defenses and losing heavily as a result. Well, I think that phase is now over. The Ukrainians are on their last legs. They have almost nothing left. Platoon, squad, sometimes company-sized elements are coming over to the Russians. The Russians have been very skillful in how they've handled Ukrainian prisoners. They've been treated well. And the Ukrainians know they can come up on a frequency, call in and say, I've had it. And that if they have numbers of wounded with them, they know their wounded will be cared for and so forth. I think at some point the truth will come out that all of the horrible atrocities of which the Russians were accused, 90% of which never happened. And if we're going to look for atrocities being committed, we'll discover over time that the Ukrainian side obviously was heavily engaged in that, tragically and unnecessarily. So I think right now Kharkov is on the menu. It will fall. At the same time, we should not overlook the fact that the rest of the defensive line is engaged in a general advance. And when I say general advance, I mean that. They're moving forward to road nets, particularly those that run parallel to the defense, as well as those that run deep to the river. They want to cut off supplies. They want to reduce reinforcements, whatever there are. They've effectively neutralized or eliminated air defenses. So there's really nothing the Ukrainians can do at this point except get out of the way. And indeed, large numbers of Ukrainian units have said that to the government in Kiev. The question is, how much longer does Mr. Zelensky left? His principal contribution to the war seems to have been to murder deliberately 600,000 Ukrainian soldiers by hurling them into the abyss. I think that's begun to sink in over in Ukraine. So I wonder every day how much longer he will be there. I suppose that depends heavily on MI6 and CIA and the various mercenaries that surround him, because I think he's losing ground inside his own country very, very rapidly. Although, once again, we never hear that in the West. There's no reporting of that. The only way I know that is because I hear from people in the region who are telling me flat out that this war is over. The Ukrainian people want nothing to do with it. They want it to end. And I think that's a blessing that this is now happening, because it tends to sober up people in Warsaw, people in Berlin, people in Paris and elsewhere to recognize this is not retrievable. Any notion of sending forces in at this point in the hopes that you could somehow or another reinforce or bolster this regime, it's just not realistic.
In Poland, there are sort of two mainstream schools of thought regarding the American position vis-a-vis the Ukrainian conflict. We're obviously on the front line of this proxy war, which is admittedly a proxy war. People in administrative positions in the West have admitted so. One school says that Biden is too weak on Ukraine, and that once the Republicans regain power, that's when we're actually going to see an improvement on the front line. And a lot of people are sort of dodging the skepticism that Trump is going to abandon Ukraine and leave NATO and so on. They're actually saying, no, we can expect at least the sense of solidarity to continue, and maybe there won't be direct money going to Ukraine, but there will be loans, as in the last tranche of money that went to 60 billion from Congress. The other school is saying that Biden has done as much as anyone could do for Ukraine, and the only thing he needs to do is do more, basically. So, and I would argue that these are two superficial schools of thought, because neither one of them is correct, because neither one of them addresses the fundamental issue. Is Ukraine of a vital interest to the United States of America to, justify large sums of money and weaponry going to that country? What's your view of this peculiarly Polish view of the situation in Ukraine?
Well, I think the Poles can be forgiven for taking these positions seriously. I mean, what else can they do? They need to understand on a strategic level where the United States is, need to understand the real basis for this proxy war and the sinister agenda inside Ukraine behind it. We are a regional hegemon in Western Hemisphere. In other words, in the Western Hemisphere, we cannot be challenged. Air, land, sea. There's nobody there that can really reasonably challenge us militarily. We're the strongest economically, politically, and so forth. That's been true almost from the inception of the country in the 1780s. We have always been stronger than our neighbors. Unfortunately, in the aftermath of the Second World War, people began to think that we could become more than a regional hegemon. And that was because we were the last man standing. Everyone else's country was effectively destroyed. We were the ones that had intact infrastructure. We had a powerful manufacturing base, all these things. This continued, but cautiously, because we were never quite sure how strong the Soviet Union was. We now know in retrospect that certainly by the 1980s, that the Soviet Union was in very poor shape and it was inevitably declining. The question was how rapidly. We discovered that by 1992 it was over. And then you get this unipolar moment nonsense where people said, well, once again, we're the only ones standing. No one else has got what we have. Look at Desert Storm, what we were able to do. We can now effectively bully anybody we like. And the initial laboratory for experimentation really was the Balkans. And these wars in the Balkans, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and then subsequently in Kosovo, were aimed at much more than the Serbs. It was aimed ultimately at Russia. And we began to see ourselves as essentially being in a position to overwhelm everyone. Well, this has failed. This has failed for a whole range of reasons. First, we were always delusional. Anybody who sets out to tell you they're going to create a world order is delusional. Anyone who wants to rule the world or what there is of it that's important is delusional. And the leadership in Washington fell, hook, line, and sinker into this terrible, terrible, tragic pond. 2001 reinforced it because you had Bush stand up and tell everyone, you're either with us or against us. So we set up, ourselves for multiple enemies. Now, all of this has to be understood along with large numbers of people in Washington and New York City and London who looked at Russia and saw this abundance of natural resources and minerals. They didn't see the connectivity inside Russia between that and military power. All they saw was what they thought was a military midget now with some nuclear weapons that they wouldn't dare use, and all of these resources that ultimately, if you could bring down Putin, bring down this new strengthening, developing regime, well, then you could strip Russia of everything. And you can read lots of stories about this. There was this man, Browder, who was in Moscow, who wrote a book called Red Notice. He effectively outlines all of this. He was chased out. Putin ultimately threw most of these people out. And if anything, we can say Putin rescued Russia from the ash heap of history, put it back on its feet. It is now a great power. It's by no means a superpower, but it is a great power, and it has to be reckoned with and respected. We didn't want to do that. So we began this proxy war because the Ukrainians were easily duped into buying into it. You always had the residual hatred for all things communist and Russian, and unfortunately there was a tendency to link Russia with communism, whether or not every Russian or every communist was a Russian didn't make any difference. And we pursued this proxy war. In doing so, we have completed the task of overextending ourselves, much as the Spanish Empire did, much as the British Empire did. We have bankrupted ourselves. I don't think any imperial structure in the history of mankind has ever been in the financial condition that we are. The national sovereign debt is beyond anyone's comprehension. The notion that it could ever be paid off is absurd. And now we live on the edge of the abyss. All the Chinese and the Japanese and the Saudis and others need to do to bring us down is to sell off our long-term treasuries, which when they were purchased at a time of zero interest rates and now are effectively worth nothing. And if they were to dump these, this would destabilize us. We've already had a series of banking crises, and many financial analysts are saying privately we're in one right now and it's only going to get worse. We don't know where our currency is going to end up. It'll probably strengthen in the short run because people will once again run to us as things fall apart in Europe. But ultimately, it's all going to collapse. So what do you do when you're on your way down and you see no way out? You throw everything into the game. And that's what we did in Ukraine on the assumption that Russia couldn't compete. Well, it was all wrong, completely false. So this war is all over except in the final chapter, which is unfolding now. And the total offensive has not yet begun, really the massive offensive. The real question is, can this regime in Kiev last until the Russians are on the streets of Kiev? We don't know. But the Russians have to answer some hard questions. No one will negotiate an end to this thing. They really would like to end it. They wanted to end it 3 years ago. So who is going to do it? We aren't. Because if we were to stand up and say, yes, this has gone far enough, we have a humanitarian disaster, the Ukrainian nation is destroyed, hundreds of thousands, 600,000 are dead soldiers, another million plus casualties, millions have left the country, more are trying to get out. They will probably, the ones that have left, never come back. What happens, and you have the usual suspects, BlackRock, Monsanto, all the big agricultural conglomerates. Monsanto has now purchased Ukraine's debt and wants to hold Ukraine hostage, and presumably it will try to steal as much of Ukraine west of the Dnieper as it possibly can. And it should frighten the Ukrainians enough to the point where they may want to think strongly about turning to Russia for assistance to avoid the catastrophe that's about to befall them, because no one in Washington will stop it. London is involved in it. I don't know where we go from here, but it's all bad news for Ukraine. The initiative is passed permanently to Russia in Eastern Europe. Now, there's one other thing here, and I said this in January before the Russians intervened in February 2022, and I was talking to Dmitry Simes at the National Interest. And I got most things right. I got one thing wrong. I thought the Russians would come in gangbusters, but I didn't understand what Putin was thinking. And he did not really want a war. He thought he was signaling seriousness of his intention and would get a negotiation, and he will save the Russians in eastern Ukraine and get the Ukrainians to say, look, Crimea is Russian, we're no longer interested, and so forth. I was wrong on that. I thought he would go after that. I didn't understand. But the one thing that I did say from the very beginning is that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, this thing we call NATO, would not survive this crisis. Behind the scenes, NATO is crumbling. The facade of solidarity is just that. It's razor thin. The Swedes and the Finns are now beginning to realize that they're signing military agreements with the United States that surrender their sovereignty to us, that give us access to bases over which they have no control, with troops and capabilities on the ground over which they have no control. Why would Sweden and Finland at this point want to invite nuclear weapons into their countries when the Russians are not interested in going to war with them and haven't been, as far as I can tell, for decades, and don't really want conflict now? Well, the same thing holds for Poland or Slovakia, or anybody who wants to host nuclear weapons from the United States. Why would you do that? And if you've learned anything from this crisis, just how much can you depend upon the United States? If you could really depend upon us and we were really serious, we'd have had a 1 million-man force on the ground in Poland, Slovakia, and Lithuania ready to fight. What have we got? Nothing that can compete. It's modest. It's a gesture what we have on the ground over there. And we should have also learned that in high-end conventional warfare, if you cannot fight on the ground, you're lost. Air power isn't going to work because air defense technology, air and missile and space technology have raced ahead. The Russians can shoot most of the stuff that we've got down. We're going to be able to do that eventually. But right now, we have no integrated air and missile defense. If we were to challenge the Russians in Ukraine militarily, Poland, Germany, Romania, the Baltic states, Scandinavia, they'd all become targeted and they would be destroyed. And there's nothing we could do about the thousands of missiles the Russians would launch. And we're not talking about nuclear weapons. We're talking about explosives and precision-guided missiles. This entire thing has been a disaster. And the Europeans are now going to have to ask themselves hard questions. How much longer do they want to be vassal states of the greater American empire? And if you juxtapose what I've just described with the situation inside the United States, the financial conditions, our economic concerns, because right now we have millions of Americans living paycheck to paycheck, who in the event of a new financial meltdown will be left with nothing. And we're living in a country that can no longer print money to the extent that it could to get out of it. In other words, we can't repeat what we did in 2008. So having said all of that, what are you going to do when the United States simply announces it's been nice, but we're leaving? And that's what's going to happen. We are going to have to retrench. We will have spent so much and expended so much equipment and resources on this ridiculous notion of fighting a war in Ukraine against Russia. We've got very little left at this point. And if you add to that the problems in the Middle East, it's only metastasizing. So we eventually are going to reach the point where we have to give up and go home. And everybody remembers that that's when the British left India. The British left India when they couldn't afford to stay. The same thing's going to happen to us. And everything we are doing is mortgaged to national vanity, not strategic necessity.
It's interesting. Every time I want to listen to a Frank Sinatra recording on YouTube, I get this funny commercial coming up in Polish. It says, "NATO makes us stronger. It's the best investment in our future." It seems there's a marketing campaign in Poland right now to make sure that nobody in Poland has any doubts as to the utility of NATO. And it almost seems as, for a formal Catholic country as Poland still is, apart from the dogmas of the Catholic faith, we have one political dogma that extra NATO nulla salus. Outside NATO, there is no salvation. It's very hard to criticize NATO in Poland. I mean, you could criticize the European Union because it's in vogue to be Eurosceptic. The Euroscepticism is on the rise, and there's a falling. The support for the European Union has fallen to at least, almost 20 points below what it was in 2003 when we were entering the European Union. But the support for NATO seems to hold strong, despite the fact that the alliance, as you mentioned, seems to be going through a crisis mode, which can be argued is even stronger than some of the things that are happening in the European Union currently. But still, the vanity that you mentioned, I think, is also present in the Polish soul, because anybody who casts any doubt on the utility of NATO in Poland, on its effectiveness, and on the logical arguments that Poland should remain in the alliance, are immediately treated as anathema. And you could easily be accused of being a Putin stooge, an agent, and so on. Well, Colonel, I want to hear from you. I mean, you were at SHAPE headquarters in 1999 during the Kosovo air campaign. You know the players, you know the people, you know the inside mechanisms. Is there really no salvation for Poland outside of NATO from your vantage point?
No, I didn't think so at the time that Poland joined NATO in 1999. I mean, there were private conversations behind the scenes with many NATO officers, senior officers, and people had mixed feelings in many cases. I would say the strongest advocates for Polish membership in NATO were the Germans, who bent over backwards, I think, out of a sense of guilt, reaching back to the Second World War, to do everything they could to support Poland's candidacy for membership, trying to believe in this Euro dream. Everybody's going to live together in the utopia, and NATO is a mechanism for that. But at the same time, the Germans and the rest of the European officers tended to believe that NATO existed to prevent future wars in Europe. And that was strange to me, because all you had to do is look at what we had done in the Balkans, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and then subsequently in Kosovo against Serbia. We'd done everything we could to bring on hostilities so that we could bomb the Serbs. as some sort of demonstration of our moral and military supremacy, with the goal of eventually sweeping all the way to Moscow in some sort of delusional democratic revolution. And that sort of nonsense had no place whatsoever at NATO. Everyone else, other than the Americans and the Brits, really wanted to live with the Russians at that point. And they tended to view Ukraine as this very useful device that could be much like Austria and provide a neutral zone between NATO and Russia, which would benefit both Russia and NATO. And that Ukraine might then become a bridge between the two, both militarily, economically, diplomatically, in a way that would make Ukraine successful. I mean, these are the kinds of things that people discuss. So, yes, let's bring Poland in order to secure the region against a future war. Well, there were a few people that said, well, I like the Poles, but don't you realize these people are incurably anti-Russian? Don't you realize that they have unfinished business? They lost a lot of territory during World War II. And then, of course, people said, well, look at the Germans. They lost lots of territory. They'd come to terms with it. And of course, they never made a distinction. Well, the Germans lost the war. They were conquered and they were an occupied country. Now, we can say the Poles lost, but in the Polish mind, they were not a defeated nation. They were a victim of the war. There's no question about it. People like Churchill as well as Stalin. But they were not defeated, and they saw themselves as having a different destiny. All you had to do was see the Polish officers and soldiers, who were brilliant. We had nothing but admiration for them. Said this is a great people with a great future. But people didn't connect the dots and realize that there was still this desire to expand Poland. And it was understandable given the history, but the problem was, is that in the interest of NATO and Europe? So there were a few people that said, why don't we just leave the Poles where they are? We can be partners strategically. They don't have to be members. But the Germans insisted that it was essential to European security that the Poles be part of the alliance, and ultimately we went along with it.
What do you say to the argument, which I think I've been doing some research on this recently. I'm actually going to be writing an article most likely about this. In 98, 97, 98, when there were discussions on the Hill about NATO expansion, you saw a lot of these arms manufacturing lobbyists going to the Hill. There was even an interesting article in the New York Times about a guy, forgot his first name, I think his last name was Jackson, who would lobby the congressman basically, we need new markets for our weapons. To me, it seems that war indeed is a racket, and one of the reasons for the expansion of NATO, under obviously the guise of, expanding the zone of security and so on, was basically to sell American weapons to new client states. And money, it's what's that famous saying from The Godfather, that behind every crime there stands, a fortune, basically, or basically the need to make money, profit. And I think the explanation for the expansion of NATO seems to me, at least from the American point of view, and you had, just to mention, a lot of reasonable people in the United States at that time warning about the effects of a potential NATO expansion. You had Jack Matlock, Henry Kissinger even made some noise about it. And obviously the most prominent of them, George Kennan, the architect of the containment strategy, the face of anti-communism and anti-Sovietism in the Cold War period, but a rational face. He even warned about the expansion of NATO, that this would only antagonize the Russians. And it seems it played out nicely because, Poland is buying 90% of inventories from the United States, the F-35, Apaches, M1 Abrams. We bought the F-16s. Anything that Washington wants us to buy, we buy at exorbitant and sometimes crazy prices. So how does the arms industry profit-making scheme, in your opinion, in your view, fit into the NATO expansion dynamic?
Well, I think it's something of a factor, but we should be honest about things. Even if Poland were not in NATO, the Poles would have bought our equipment anyway. They were always predisposed to do that. When I was privately consulted, I said it would make more sense for the Poles and the Germans to cooperate for equipment, because then you have spare parts and logistical support coming straight out of Poland straight out of Germany into Poland. Made the same argument to the Czechs, Slovaks, and others, because I argued that the Europeans needed to develop their own capacities. In other words, why not turn to the Germans and say, build a plant here? And I think those things at the time were eminently possible. We, of course, had no interest in that. We weren't interested in a European capability. Why would we want the Europeans to be able to do anything? We wanted them to be dependent upon us. That's very clear.
Colonel, are we seeing the beginning of the end of the power of the Israel lobby in the United States?
I think it's too soon to tell, but it is clearly being severely weakened. I think, again, this is another exercise in hubristic overreach. I think the Israelis thought that they could exploit 7 October in order to do what they have wanted to do for a very long time. And they told themselves, not unreasonably, this is the time to do it because we have complete control of the United States government. No one is going to stop us. No one will be interested in stopping us. In fact, we have such thorough ownership of the government that people will fall all over themselves to support us. Well, we've seen a lot of evidence for it, but what they haven't bargained for was the reaction of the population in the United States and around the world to what they're doing. And I think they had an unrealistic expectation that they could control the information because of their enormous influence over media as well as finance. So it's too soon to reach any conclusions. But right now, I would argue that the Israelis are in a very difficult position. They cannot back down. If they back down, they will recognize internally as well as publicly that they've lost, that their efforts against Hamas have failed, but their efforts regionally are failing. Remember, they've worked very, very hard to create the illusion that they can defeat everyone and anyone. And if you question them, they pat their nuclear warheads and say, yeah, but we still have this. We've now listened to Erdogan and others in the region say, we don't care about that. We're not afraid of you. And I think that they have affected a coalition of the Muslim peoples, the Arabs, Turks, Iranians across the entire region. Now, what they don't yet face are governments in Cairo, Jordan, Riyadh, and in the Emirates that will fight against them. Right now, there is a tremendous gap of feeling, thinking, emotion, and understanding between the populations and their ruling elites. I would not be surprised to see many of these ruling houses in the Arabian Peninsula go away as a result. Because whereas they sit and are, in the words drawn from the Quran, fat and corrupt, the populations do not. They view what's happening as an atrocity, as an abomination, as an insult, and a direct challenge to the Islamic world. And I think that's only going to get worse with the passage of time. And now that we see that the Israelis are going to go into Rafah, I don't see how anything good comes out of that. It will simply add fuel to the fire that is burning ferociously against Israel. So the real question is, will Israel survive all of this? Because it's quite clear that he wants to finish the job against Hamas and then turn on Hezbollah. Well, that's a suicidal action. That will bring everybody else down on his head at some point. So I can't imagine what they're doing working, but they believe that this is their best shot, and they are willing to risk everything on one throw of the dice, which in international relations, as you know, is always a serious mistake.
Colonel, just 2 more questions. We'll get back to Poland in the last one, but I just want to ask you about, it's sort of like Yogi Berra used to say, it's deja vu all over again. The Democrats are having their convention this year, of all places in Chicago, just like in 1968. And we've obviously seen in recent weeks the large demonstrations by the student activists against the genocide taking place in Gaza. Whatever you think of the protests, whether they've gone too far or have not done enough, there has been a serious crackdown, which is kind of interesting because if you remember the so-called Summer of Love in 2020, there was no such crackdown on literal violence that was destroying America from the inside. It would seem that as you mentioned, the power of the Israel lobby is sort of pulling the strings on this issue because the crackdowns have been severe, they've been immediate, and they've been fairly strong. And we're talking about students for the most part here, not adults taking part in looting stores and so on. But what do you sense will happen in Chicago? I believe the convention is in August. Are we going to see a repetition of that great fight between Mayor Daley's cops and the protesters back in '68? Or will Biden be able to buy off his base by that time? What's your prediction in this regard?
I think Biden will either be gone and no longer on the scene by the convention, or he will announce at the convention that he is not going to run again, and they will pick someone else who does not carry the burden of Biden's behavior towards the world, frankly. In other words, someone else who sounds much more reasonable and approachable. I don't know who that is. That could be any number of people. Remember, the Democrats, their name is misleading because they absolutely do not pay any attention to democratic norms when it comes to selecting candidates. They crush the people they don't want. They pick the people they do want. They have these people called superdelegates. And I think they'll just pick someone. Now, people have mentioned Newsom. I suppose that's a possibility. I don't know who they have in mind. I mean, somebody has even said to me, well, they could bring back Hillary Clinton. I don't think they will, but I think that's true. That's something they could do. We also don't know what comes out of the Republican convention. I think assuming that Donald Trump is the inevitable man is a mistake. An awful lot could happen between now and the Republican convention, and you might be surprised what happens there. I think we're in a very different setting today from any we've ever seen in our history. But clearly, Chicago will be disruptive. It'll be problematic. There's no question about it. And I think what we learn is that Orwell was correct. Remember, Orwell said, if you want to know who runs the country, identify the people who can't be criticized, and you know who is in charge. We now have this new law that was passed in the House under the leadership of Mr. Johnson, the Speaker. Mr. Speaker Johnson is the #1 recipient of Israel lobby money. I guess that's no accident. And everyone was rushing head over heels to transform anyone who raises any objections to anything that anyone anywhere who is Jewish says or does is a criminal. That tells you volumes. It's frightening. I would think if I were Jewish, I would not have welcomed this development. I think this calls attention to Jews in a way that I, as a Jew, would never want. But, you know, that's what's happened. We'll see whether or not it gets through the Senate. I see no reason why it shouldn't. I see no reason why Biden wouldn't sign off on it quickly, but then again, so would Trump. And I think that RFK Jr. would probably do so as well. So maybe Orwell was right, and he's got us by the throat right now. I don't know, but it's a strange environment. But this breeds hubris, it breeds arrogance, it breeds overreach. Overreach in the Middle East, overreach in Ukraine, overreach here inside the United States. And all the while that everyone is throwing money and ammunition at Israel and still insisted on dumping whatever is left to Ukraine, we have open borders. We have effectively consigned ourselves to the ash heap of history if this continues, because we will have millions of people inside our country who are not only not Americans, they have no interest in being Americans, and they've been told that's just fine. Come as you are. We don't care. And of course, the criminality rising across the country compares favorably with the criminality in places like Stockholm and Berlin and elsewhere, and Paris. All of this is contributing to the notion that we are finished as a great power. And yet we behave the way we do on the world stage as though we are the ultimate superpower who cannot be challenged. We've already been challenged and defeated in Ukraine. It remains to be seen what happens in the Middle East. But I worry there that we have also overreached, and that Israel has overreached and put itself very much at risk. And with it, our prestige, our power, our influence that could be damaged for decades.
Thank you once again for your time, and we hope to see you soon, and keep on doing the excellent work that you are.
Thank you, Dr. Krupa, and God bless Poland.
Thank you. God bless America.